All right. No discussion of human evolution would be complete without talking about the behavioral changes that we see among some of our hominin ancestors. And here we're going to take a look at their Paleolithic tool traditions and the use of fire and how that impacted our biology and our anatomy. We can move to the next slide. We had pointed out earlier that the leakeys at Olduvai Gorge were responsible for identifying the first modified objects in association with hominin fossils. So the tools, the mode one, or the first mode of tools that emerged, we refer to as the Oldowan tradition. And we see an example here. We have cutters, we have choppers, we have scrapers, and you'll note there's no way that this material was attached to a stick, so they didn't have spears. They didn't have arrows. They were scavenging meat. They weren't going out and hunting those animals that they were consuming. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how we know this. So, the Oldowan tradition we want to associate with Homo habilis, and this African biped had begun to anticipate or at least engaged in some form of abstract thought that allowed it to imagine a new purpose for a rock. And as pointed out, we see this species here, Homo habilis, it's using kind of an anvil and hammer to break open that bone and get at the marrow. Let's move on to the next slide. The second tradition, or mode 2, emerges with Homo erectus, and we name it after the area that it was first discovered in France, and they're referred to as the Acheulean tool tradition. Now, this tradition, it's remarkably different from the earlier Oldowan tradition. What we have here is not so much of a simple flaking technique when it comes to making those stone tools. They engaged in that, so they take a core, they knock a flake off, but they also engaged in further refining that flake into what's called a biface. So this is double-edged, and this material, again, we're a little bit later on, it is attached to, for example, spears. Homo erectus was, in fact, a hunter. Let's move to the next slide. So Homo erectus, on a test, we want to be able to say that it uses the Acheulean tool tradition, and it was getting at meat in a fundamentally different way than Homo habilis was. It was an active hunter, and that process of hunting led it to a different migratory pattern such that it began to move out of Africa in search of food. Let's move on and take a look at the third tradition that we're interested in. Mode 3, again named after a region of France where it was first discovered, is called the Mousterian tradition. Now, the Mousterian tradition, it represents a flake. We can see that flake, and it also involves reworking the edges to create a biface. And we clearly see in the bottom corner a type of implement or a type of stone tool that could be attached to sticks and would be used for hunting. The Mousterian tradition, if we move to the next slide, the Mousterian tradition then is associated with Neanderthals. Um, so over time, we continue to see changes. We eventually see the use of bone, and that's ultimately with modern Homo sapiens. Let's move on to the next slide, and there'll be a link to a video you can watch. Now, I had pointed out that Homo habilis was not a hunter. And one of the questions we always should have is, how do you know that? Where does that information come from? So what I had referred to it as was a tertiary scavenger. In other words, a third-party scavenger, something that came along after the fact and ultimately appropriated the rest of the resources that remained on the carcass. How do we get at that information? If we look at the right of the screen, what we see are a number of cut marks. Now, under microscopic analysis, what we understand about these cut marks is they're on top of tooth marks. So that tells us that another animal first scavenged this animal, may be responsible for killing it. It consumed the meat that it was interested in eating. Once it had enough, it left, and along came, for example, Homo habilis, maybe scared away the vultures that were there, and it continued to render the meat on this particular carcass. So a few points. We've got cut marks, and they overlie animal tooth marks. So that tells us that Homo habilis was not the individual that was responsible for killing this particular animal. The other thing that we see with respect to Homo habilis is that increase in brain size. And here I want to make that formal connection to a change in diet, that behavioral change, and the impact that it had upon the brain of Homo habilis. As a result of these changes in brain size, eventually we see new cultural adaptations, and we continue to have the process of that cultural evolution over time. Now, all of this stuff, it created a more successful species. And when we're thinking of evolution, we always have to put it into that reproductive success framework. Is it allowing the species to reproduce more successfully? And if so, that species has a greater opportunity or greater chance of passing on these new genes or these new frequencies of alleles to its offspring. And over long periods of time, we get that evolution that we've been talking about, that macro evolution. As for other species, they began to engage in new behavioral strategies as well. Before we go on to that, let's just take a brief look at what was taking place with the stomach and the brain in these early hominins. Now this slide highlights some of the differences between Australopithecus afarensis and, for example, Homo erectus. We would have also seen similar changes taking place with Homo habilis. So the Australopithecines, as vegetarians, they had a larger or more complicated gastrointestinal system represented in the area that's been highlighted. In contrast, Homo erectus, it has a smaller gastrointestinal system, and you don't need that complex system to manage meat in the same way that you do vegetation. Now, the other point here, according to Wrangham, he's an anthropologist. He wrote a book called Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human. He points out that the gut is actually a very expensive tissue. It takes a lot of energy to make that operate from a physiological or metabolic perspective. The same thing is true of a brain. A brain requires 33 times more energy than any other muscle in the body. So the logic goes, you can't have two expensive tissues. You can't have an expensive gut and an expensive brain. So as we started to go through this shift, as we began to change from a vegetarian diet to one that relied upon more meat rather than vegetation, the gut eventually changes over size. A smaller size, a less expensive gut is selected for. And as we begin to utilize protein, which is great for tissue, we're able to redirect that glucose to the brain, and that eventually causes this expansion in the hominin brain, and it increasingly gets larger over time. Now, the other component that we had pointed out, it wasn't simply that we're eating meat that gives us protein, but raw meat can only provide so much protein. The next really big step, as Wrangham points out, is cooking, the use of fire. And we see that with Homo erectus, and that's why we see such a big difference again from Homo habilis to Homo erectus.